Welcome back to Hot Flashes and Cool Topics. Today I have on a really cool guest, and unfortunately Bridget is going to miss it because she is traveling. But I have on Omisade Burney-Scott, who is the founder, curator, creator of the Black Girl's Guide to Surviving Menopause. Welcome to the show.
Thank you. Thank you for the invitation. I'm glad to be here with you.
Well, I've been excited for the conversation, number one, because we're just all in the same experience right now. And I love talking to women who can understand this stage of life, because I think we have so much to offer. We have so much wisdom, and it needs to be shared. It needs to be heard. So I have been following you on Instagram for a while, and I'm seeing all the great things you're doing, both with the platform and with the Kindra deck that we're going to talk about a little later. But I wanted to start with, why did you decide? I know there was like a year of rest, but why did you decide to start this platform?
That's a really good question. I think that during the creative sabbatical that I took from social justice work, because I've been doing social justice and nonprofit work since 1995, I knew that I wanted to sit down, spend time with, listen to, talk to Black women, women identified and gender expansive people who are my age or older initially. Like, I really wanted to talk to my peers, and I wanted to talk to folk who were older than me, just kind of how they're navigating life. Like, how are you navigating as a menopausal person or a postmenopausal person? What do your relationships look like right now in your life? What does work and creativity look like? What does intimacy and romance or pleasure look like? I just wanted to talk about all the things. And because I really enjoy storytelling and I'm a storyteller, and understand the power of story, I was thinking these are going to be really rich, potent conversations. I should probably record them or document them in some way or fashion. Initially thinking like for myself, if I want to return to them at some point in my life and use them, or if I want to share them publicly. And so I sat down with a couple of really good friends who are creatives here in Durham, where I live. And they said, you should maybe consider doing a podcast. And I love podcasts. So I was like, this is a really good idea. I think I'll do that. And my producer, Mariah, who's one of the folk that I sat down with, actually offered me the name. They said, you should call it the Black Girl's Guide to Surviving Menopause. And I was like, that's a great name. And so what has happened over the last 3 years, we are now in season 4 of the podcast, but what has happened over the last 3 years of figuring out like how we're engaging in this menopausal landscape is that we're really clear that the like culture and narrative shift work that we're engaged in has to center the stories of the most marginalized people. Because if we don't, then we will kind of replicate as people get older, as people are navigating menopause, the same type of erasure or invisibilization that's really complicated inside of women's health and health equity. And I did not want to do that. And it also goes against kind of the way that I'm shaped and how my work has been framed over the last however many years. So it became a very easy thing to make sure that we were centering those voices and those stories. And so that's kind of how we ended up deciding on a podcast. And of course, not everybody likes podcasts. You know this.
Well, from our own personal experience being in the podcast, we've been doing this 2.5 years now, and we kind of put the seatbelt on to see where it would go. We had a similar idea in that we wanted a community that of women, not just in menopause, but midlife, because a lot of women at this stage feel invisible and don't feel seen and heard. So we're always talking about how we have similar situations, similar symptoms, but there is a difference here. And I love that you are talking to part of our demographic that may not feel their voices being heard.
Mm-hmm.
How has that evolved through your journey in doing the podcast and the platform?
In terms of the voices that
Yes. In terms of the voices and the responses that you're getting, because we are always like, oh, well, we're all going through this together with each individual experience. But you're saying, yes, but there is a section of our female demographic that is experiencing it differently than you might be.
Well, there's just a part of a demographic notwithstanding gender or age that's going through it. It's different. And so I think it's always curious to me when I love this question, and it's always a curiosity to me around how people see people fully in their full personhood. And so as a person is standing in front of you, I don't make any assumptions around who that person is. I actually invite them to tell me who they are. Right. And so I think that's really critical when we're thinking about, as we're experiencing right now in the country and politically, people not feeling like they have agency or bodily autonomy over their bodies. And so many people have very different identities, different ethnicities, different races, different cultures, different social economic backgrounds. There's so many differences that are really context and really critical, because if we don't see that, or find a way to make room for that, then the folk who are already experiencing likely systemic oppression or marginalization, contemporarily and generationally, will be pushed further to the margins. And I didn't want to be complicit in that at all. And so, yes, generally speaking, well, you and I are similar physiologically because we both, were born women. And so we have similar physical parts, right?
Right.
But I'm an African American woman who's seventh generation born in North Carolina. And we have different lived experiences, which doesn't negate your experiences or amplify mine. It's a truism. And so part of what I am trying to offer people, not as a spokesperson, but as someone who is holding space for people to tell their own stories and to also listen to stories, is that we cannot make assumptions about how people will experience menopause. We can't make an assumption about their gender. We can't make an assumption about how they experience it differently or similarly based on race or ethnicity or culture. And we can't make assumptions about age. And so throughout the podcast, throughout the 4 seasons, we have offered a real wide range of voices, perspectives, realities, truths, stories, narratives, information, so that way people can hopefully see themselves more fully inside of the platform we've created. Maybe they don't feel as isolated or alone or scared. And also it might give people information that they had not had access to previously, or some unlearning can happen around the assumptions we make about bodies and whose bodies are going to experience menopause.
One of the things that we learned pretty early on in our podcast was that there's just not enough information getting out to women about what they're going through, even from doctors. Have you found that to be a similar situation for your podcast?
Oh yeah, absolutely. The vast majority of people who contact us, who are our listeners, and also, a good portion of our guests, shared that they didn't feel like they had received any kind of substantive information about menopause to prepare them for it. And then once they were actually experiencing perimenopausal symptoms, whether they were very intense or not, that some of the reactions that they received either from their healthcare provider or folk inside their families was like varying. And so I think that generally speaking, most people I speak to, or who reach out to us, say, I'm so glad there's a platform where we can be very transparent and honest about what we're experiencing. And so glad that you're talking about a lot of different ways to understand menopause. So not just from a physiological or health perspective, but also from a mental health perspective, also from a sexual health perspective, also from a very spiritual, sacred perspective. And I also, because of the way that I see the world, will add in there a social political perspective for people to understand. One of the reasons I think that we are not seeing people talk about menopause, that there's not, in my opinion, intersectional menopause research or policies to protect menopausal people, is because of systemic oppression like patriarchy, misogyny, homophobia, white supremacy. And so we kind of apologetically give people an opportunity to be curious about that too. Like, why am I experiencing care differently from my colleague? Or what's happening to me inside of the workplace? Is this a function of ageism as well? Like, to give people the tools that they need to have the agency they need to be able to navigate this experience, and not feel isolated, or to feel like there's something wrong with them.
And I think, in listening to what you're saying, I agree 100% with all of it. And I think recently in the last couple weeks, it's just been hit, hit, hit for
Right,
women,
right,
one after the other.
right.
And how do you, I mean, I know for me, I just have such an anger for, I have two daughters, and I feel like I must have like somehow let them down, that this is what they're entering the next phase of life with. And what can we do
Mhm, mhm.
as women in this demographic to make difference? And what have you found has been the kind of temperature around what's been happening the last few weeks?
Well, part of my past work experience and commitment in community has been reproductive justice. So I've done justice advocacy work for quite some time. It's probably now going on about 10 years, a little over 10 years. Um, and what I'm realizing is that I kind of sit in a place of odd privilege for folk who think that privilege has more so to do with affluence, influence, and rather than your mindset and your work. I sit in a place of privilege because I have been working with people who've been on the front lines of repo justice and repo rights work for quite some time now. And so I know that there's a very robust community of people who are very much dedicated to protecting our ability to engage in bodily autonomy to protect ourselves, and who have been engaging in advocacy and policy work and saw this coming, and also have been doing their best to engage in um, voter engagement, civic engagement, making sure we get voters to the polls, because we know this is also very much a political issue. And I think that part of what my understanding is kind of for the general public. I always think about, what would I say to my cousin who doesn't do the work I do, who doesn't understand the work I do, but is certainly going to be impacted by what's happening. Like, how am I going to make sure that they feel like they know what exactly is happening, and if they want to be activated to support, participate, or now become part of the movement, what's an on ramp for them. And I see that happening more and more, where people are wanting to figure out, where's my on ramp to this work? Where's my on ramp to understanding? And the first thing I will always say is, start at home, start in your own backyard, start in your local community, connect with local repo rights and reproductive justice organizations in your local community or in your state. If you don't have the capacity, and also your political awareness around what's happening isn't quite there yet, you can do a very simple, basic thing, is make a financial contribution to these groups who know what to do, right? And then I think it's important to figure out how to volunteer. I think it's important for people to have the agency and be responsible for their learning. And so, like, how you get connected to these organizations that do, I think, a very beautiful, amazing, robust political education for new people who are coming into movement space to understand the context of what's happening is not a spontaneous event. This has been decades of work. Right. And so this is part of what political education looks like, is to help people understand you are entering into this landscape in this moment, but this moment has a through line that precedes you. And how do we get you up to speed on the through line, so you understand the players, you understand the landscape, you understand the ecosystem that we're talking about? And certainly, again, part of what I am seeing from colleagues and friends who do this work is that we want to make sure that the conversation is very expansive, and we want to give people opportunities to figure out how they can activate. And so part of that is making sure that we don't um, make assumptions about what people know or how people want to be engaged.
It is very interesting. As a former lawyer, I follow this very closely from the legal perspective, but
Hmm.
I have found that it is really interesting, the arguments that young women are coming up with since the reversal of Roe v. Wade. And by that, I mean, well, why isn't it falling under this amendment? Well, why aren't we doing this? Well, what they're getting really creative. And I love that is an aspect. Obviously, like you said, it's a journey. It's not not a destination. It's going to be a long journey to get there. But I do love that they're getting much more involved and creative in.
I think that most of the millennials and Gen Z folk that I'm in community with have a much more sophisticated political
Right.
analysis that I had that in my early 20s or into, I guess I started working in social justice when I was around 27, 28. And I'm grateful that I was able to be in community and relationship with folk who were part of the civil rights movement, who were like our mentors. And I also realized that a lot of what we saw, in addition to the really, really important context and education they provided us around how to do movement work, they also didn't necessarily take good care of themselves. And so I think that the next generation of folk are trying to figure out, one, what is our political understanding? How are we grappling with this? How are we being activated, whether it's to work explicitly for a social justice organization or to volunteer or to be an individual donor or to use the platform you have. A lot of people will use social media as a platform to exchange information, share information. But I also think that they are figuring out ways to do this work in ways that are sustainable, so that way they are healthy physically and emotionally and mentally. And that's something that I've been in a process of learning and unlearning some of not so healthy work habits that exist inside of movement work, because it's critical work, and this is very much heartfelt work, it's passion work. And so it feels hard to turn yourself off and give yourself the respite that you need, especially when what's happening is happening to people who look like you, whether it's because of your gender or because of your race. And so when you see something happen in the community, there's trauma, right? Whether it's visceral trauma, but it's repetitive. And so we know that people who experience like generational trauma are not healthy. Like, it's very hard to be physically and emotionally healthy when you're experiencing trauma after trauma after trauma. And you also are on the front lines of the movement work, which is policy, which is advocacy, which is political education. You've got to find ways to take care of yourself. And there is an aging of this movement. And a lot of the people who were on the front lines of repo rights and repo justice are menopausal or postmenopausal people, whether they define themselves or identify as women or not. They're definitely menopausal or postmenopausal. And my concern is like, well, how are you taking care of yourself in the midst of really staying committed to this work and this fight that's so crucial for this generation?
And I think that lends me to my next question, which is, you've been very honest about mental health and your own mental health struggles. I'm very honest about mine on the podcast as well.
Mhm.
What have you found? I mean, I know around age 45 when I started perimenopause, and again, I had no idea I was in perimenopause. I thought, oh, all of this anxiety was situational. My daughter wasn't well, my father was dying. You always make excuses, but yet the anxiety grew.
Mhm.
When you kind of hit that clinical depression stage, what worked for you to get help? Because a lot of women in our demographic, and I think our generation, just think we have to just deal with it, suck it up and deal with it.
Yeah.
So
It's,
what worked for you, or what
it's,
helped you?
yeah, it's interesting that you say that. I had lunch yesterday with one of my friends who's also a mentor, and Trudy's probably 18 years older than me. And I said that one of the generational markers of Gen X is that we have to prove our worth tangibly. That
Mhm.
that society, capitalism, whatever, has framed it or raised us up in high school and in college, that if you're doing something of worth, prove it. Let me see. Oh, no, and I need to, like, can I hold it in my hand? Is it a book? Is it a widget? Is it a toy? Is it like, I need to see it physically. And then I'm going to judge for myself whether or not I think what you've done is worthy. And so it's always this kind of like, it was a very pervasive, persistent externalization around worth. Your worth is evidenced by your degree. Your worth is evidenced by whether or not you marry. Your work is evidenced whether or not you have children. Your work is evidenced by your position or title inside of whatever industry that you are in. Are you the director? Are you the executive director? Are you the CEO? And if you can't provide societally the evidence, then are you worthy of any kind of care or respect? No, that's what society has said. But I know that's not true. I know that's absolutely not true. You are valuable just because you simply exist. You are valuable
Exactly.
because you are a person, a whole person with lived experiences. And you are valuable and worthy of being respected, affirmed, supported, loved, cared for, cheered on, no matter what. Doesn't matter what you do. It is more about who you are and what you want to be. And I was diagnosed with clinical depression in 2016. So it was a year before my 50th birthday. And I was working so hard with a previous employer, and I was traveling all over North Carolina doing work around healthy communities, ironically, uh, healthy eating, active living. And I just was kind of shrinking. Like I was not happy. I couldn't figure out what was going on with me. My oldest son had just graduated from college the year before. I had gotten divorced 3 years before that. My youngest son was in elementary school. I'm traveling, I'm working, and I just felt like I was shrinking, like something inside of me was shrinking. And I physically lost 40 pounds in about 6 to 8 weeks. So I
Wow.
thought I had cancer. I was like, okay, I'm done. They're gonna, we're gonna do all these tests, and my doctor's gonna say, Omi, I'm sorry, but you've got cancer. Or I thought I had an autoimmune issue because my mother had sarcoidosis and that's what she passed away from. Like I had all these scenarios because I'm also like a notorious WebMD.
Uh-oh, get off the Google.
Get off Google and stop self-diagnosing yourself. You are not a medical professional. Um, and so we did all this test, we did all this blood work, and my primary care physician came back to me. He said, there is nothing physiologically wrong with you. So we need to figure something else out. So I scheduled myself with my therapist, who I had been seeing off and on for a number of years. And we had our meeting, and he was very clear. It's like, you are clinically depressed. You're also experiencing anxiety. And so I facilitated a conversation between my therapist and my primary care physician as Team Omi. So we were all on the same page about what my care was going to look like. It was the first time in my life also that I actually ever considered not being here physically. And that was a really harrowing thought for me. And in retrospect, I feel like what I was really wanting was to just not be in so much pain or so much confusion. It's not that I didn't want to necessarily be gone forever. I just didn't want to be in that moment. And so I really struggled with being present, really struggled with like trying to figure out a way, like, what am I going to do? How am I going to stay here when I'm so incredibly sad and unhappy and I don't feel good? And it's just like, it just felt like a real chore to continue to want to be here. And I have such a beautiful collection and circle of friends and spiritual community. And it was some of my very best girlfriends who came to me in one of those pivotal moments and stayed with me. And that was also at the same time when I was going to the doctor and going to the therapist. And I'm grateful for my girlfriends showing up at my house at 10 o'clock at night, and staying the night with me, making sure that I was okay, making sure that my youngest son was okay. And they said they were going to ride with me throughout that journey. And I'm grateful for that. So it was a combination of deep community here, people who know me and see me and love me. And we have what I consider like a very beautiful reciprocal relationship based on authenticity, not on perfection. And my spiritual community and my doctors. I adore the friendship that I have with both my children. My oldest son is 30, but I'm very clear they're not my peers. And
Right.
the differentiation.
Exactly. And I agree with you. It's wonderful as they get older to have a different way to communicate. But again, like you said, they're not peers.
Yeah, parenting an adult child is real different.
Isn't it? Oh my gosh.
It's real. Yeah, you realize because my eldest son turned 30 back in March, and I was like, gosh, I can offer opinion, but there's none of this like, this is what I want you to do and I expect you to do it kind of thing. And nor should it be. And so whenever we're talking, we talk quite often. If he's grappling with something, I'll ask him, do you want me to just listen? Do you want me to problem solve? Like, what do you want? What do you need from me in this moment? And so he'll say, I just need you to listen, Mom. I'm like, all right. And then I'll listen. And then he'll say, thank you so much for listening. I said, you're very welcome. Or if he says, I need you to problem solve, I said, okay. So I don't interrupt him. I give him all the space he needs to process. And then I first want to ask him, what do you think you want to do?
Right.
What feels like what you want to do? Tell me what your options are. Give me 3, And then I'll say, okay, here's my opinion and here's what I can offer you. Does that feel good to you? Is that useful? And he was like, yes, that's useful. So that's our exchange,
And that's a great way to do it. I think, having been through therapy myself, that is what they suggest, is that you listen, you ask for their, what do they think are some of their choices? And then you just kind of give your opinion and say, for what it's worth, this is my opinion. And, but I respect that this is your journey and you have to do what's best for you. So I hope the listeners hear that, because we get a lot of emails from women going, how do I parent an adult child? And it's really not about parenting, and it's a different level. You're always their parent, but now it's like almost like a mentor kind of relationship.
Yeah, it really is, like a mentor or older friend. I've been very blessed to have older friends in my life, like my friend Trudy and my friend Faith. And today is the heavenly birthday of one of my dearest friends. She would be 92 today.
Wow.
And she became like another parent to us. And I never felt like I was engaged in a relationship with them that was extractive, where the way that they shared their perspective with me was just them filling me up like I was an empty vessel. It was always like, there's always this back and forth, always a way that we tend to each other. But I always would give them their proper deference and respect, because they are older than me and they do have different perspective and they have different wisdom. And I will never catch up with their lived experience. And so it didn't make sense to me to act like we were peers, but it's certainly such a sweet, sweet, sweet relationship, sweet friendships of caretaking and laughing and support, emotional support, spiritual support. I'm grateful for these relationships and that we get to pour into each other rather than it being extractive. And I think that's one of the things I've talked about quite a bit with menopause and getting older as well, is that I don't desire to have extractive relationships with people who are younger than me. I would like for there to be reciprocity. I believe in energetic reciprocity. I believe in spiritual reciprocity. And so in the relationships I have with millennials and Gen Zs who are coming behind us on this menopausal journey, if we're in relationship, our relationship is reciprocal. It's not, Omi, can you fill me up? Omi, can you give me what you have? And then I walk away and then I leave you kind of hold out. I was like, no, I want to learn from you, which I'm glad my producer, Mariah, is a millennial and they're amazing and brilliant. And I learned so much from Mariah. And I do feel that we have a reciprocity in our relationship where I learn from her, she learns from me, I fill them up, she fills me up. And so it's not extractive.
That I always call it energy vampires. If there's someone who's just taking that energy and not.
Colleen. And it feels like it becomes an easier thing for folk to unintentionally or unconsciously be energy vampires when you're older, right? Because people will say, can I pick your brain? That's one of my pet peeves.
No, you may not.
May not pick my brain. I mean, this 55-year-old brain is doing the best that she can. So no, you may not pick my brain, but I'm happy to share what I can with you. And what are you going to offer me?
I love that. I love that. That's so true. And I think a lot of us don't even think that way. We
Right.
don't even think for some women in our demographic, just being asked, what's your opinion on something, or can you help me with this, makes them feel like, okay, I'm important. I'm being seen. But yet you walk away exhausted because you weren't recharged by anything.
We're not recharged, and I desire to be recharged in all of, especially in my very intimate, authentic relationships. It may not be the case with some one-offs. It may not be the case with like partnerships or collaborations that only happen kind of in a very like surface level place. But the deeper relationships that I'm committed to, that I'm engaged in principal struggle with, that we're loving each other, I need this to be back.
Right. Exactly. No, I agree with you. I definitely agree with you. I want to make sure that we talk about the Black Girl's Guide to Surviving Menopause. What have you noticed that is different in some of the experiences for Black women in menopause as opposed to other, maybe my experience in menopause or this woman's experience? Are there distinctions?
There are distinctions, and I would say I am not an expert, I'm not a menopause expert, so just want to.
I get you. No, they know we always say we're not an expert, but we will find the expert to answer your question.
I'm not an expert. I have opinions. I'm very curious, and I'm a student of culture. So
Right.
I will offer what I have learned. I think that the differences that I've learned inside of the Black Girl's Guide for people who are Black identified has all to do with culture and society, right? And so, you will hear people who will refer to the SWAN study. And the SWAN study, for some of your listeners who may not be familiar, is one of the oldest, longest, broadest longitudinal studies around women's health, like big bucket women's health. And inside of that longitudinal study was a segment on menopause. And inside that segment was a very kind of quick, like, nod to the fact that Black women, Indigenous women, Latinx women, Asian women experience menopause differently than their white peers. It may come on earlier, it may last longer, the symptoms, physical symptoms may be more intense, but it stopped. There was a period. There wasn't a semicolon, there wasn't a continuation, there wasn't a deeper dive into, and why might that be? And so when you look at the societal context of Black women, Indigenous women, Asian women, Latinx women, other women of color, what are they experiencing that white women aren't? Certainly, most of us who are women or women identified in some way, shape, or form have experienced gender bias. We've likely experienced sexism. And as we get older, we likely have experienced some type of ageism, right? But when you don't share the same racial identity or cultural identity, then what I've experienced as a Black person living in the United States, or a Black person who lives in the South, we have very divergent experiences. They're not just based on an individual experience, because I also feel like that's really important to say. There are individual experiences that happen inside of you, inside of your family of origin, inside of your community, that are very individualized and specific. And they're also undeniably cultural experiences that we've had in this country as people who are descendants of formerly enslaved people, who then also went through Jim Crow, who also have been like not had bodily autonomy or our bodies protected since our arrival in this country as chattel. So when you're thinking about how a person might feel differently about their experience with menopause or getting older, all of that kind of factors in, which is again an opportunity to see a person's whole personhood. I imagine that when a person goes to the doctor, no matter who they are, if a doctor can look at you and understand that you're coming and you're sitting on that piece of paper on that table, as a whole person with all these lived experiences, and how they can be curious about all of who you are. So that way the treatment is specific to you and not the person who just left the room, right? Because that wouldn't make any sense. Like, even if you're sisters, if you and your sister went in there and y'all had similar situations going on, you would not get treated the same way because you're
Sure.
two different people. And so when the question comes up for us through the platform, well, Omi, what's different about Black people? Everything. It sounds trite for me to respond that way, but it's legitimately true, both individually. Um, I'm not the same as my sister. I'm not the same as my best friend. I'm not the same as my cousin. But then we also, as Black women who were raised in the South, have similar lived experiences because of systemic pieces, right? These larger cultural pieces. And I think it's really important for us to not only acknowledge that, but for that to be a part of what drives this kind of ever growing menopause landscape and
Right.
ecosystem. When we're talking about, we need to normalize menopause. Language matters. Language matters. So I will always say Black women, women identified and gender expansive people. I'm not going to misgender people. I'm not going to invisibilize people. I'm not going to erase people. I don't have a problem with saying women, but I also don't have a problem with saying gender expansive. And it's really important because it's a keen ear to the folk who listen to the podcast or who might participate in our intergenerational gatherings. Or, we have these monthly IG Live conversations. We have Millennial Mondays, Nacho Mama's Menopause.
I like that one.
Excuse me. That's my favorite one. And we have What's Up, Doc? And so they're in real time. The way the IG Live works, you can join, you can leave, you can do whatever. But I would really, really be remiss if somebody who's been struggling or trying to figure out what's happening to them and they don't identify the same way I do, and they happen upon the conversation and I'm using language that kind of cuts them off.
Right.
Right. It's like, oh, this is not a conversation for me. They're not thinking about me. They don't care about me. And that's not true. I do. I'm thinking about you. I care about you. Your experience is important. We just interviewed a trans masculine genderqueer person who experienced menopause in their late 20s because they had gender affirming surgery. So where does Austin see themselves inside of this menopause landscape? How are they being seen and respected in their full personhood? How is their story being elevated as a story that exists inside of all of the stories that are being shared around menopause? Austin's story is just as important as Mama D's story, who today's her birthday, and she was the second person we ever interviewed for the podcast. Their stories are very different. Their experiences are very different. They're both Black people, and their stories are critical for folk to understand the diversity of experiences that people can have with menopause.
That is so important because we often talk about the fact that, you may get 15 minutes in a doctor's office.
You might, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And they're not going to inquire about your history, your differences, what makes you unique. And then on top of that, they're not really educated in school about menopause to begin with.
It's terrible.
So you're working at that deficit to begin with when they walk in the room.
Right. It's awful. It's like, not only do they not get the training while they're in school, but then after they're out of school, I think it's like less than 3% of OBGYNs would say that they in earnest are providing expert support around menopause. One of the things I suggested people, because I am definitely that girlfriend who will go with you to your doctor's appointment, is to simply say to your doctor, especially if it's a new doctor that you haven't established a relationship with, and say, listen, is it possible for us to just talk before you do any kind of examination? Can we talk? Do you have enough time to talk to me? And if they say, we got back-to-back patients, I don't actually have that time. So can I schedule a follow-up either over the phone or come back in, because I need you to know me.
Right.
Is that possible? And if the doctor bristles and says, well, I don't know, then that might not be the doctor for you. And I
Right.
understand people have different types of insurance. You might be uninsured or underinsured, and you might not have a lot of flexibility. But if you do have that flexibility, I really want to strongly encourage people to take that time to say, I need you to know that. I interviewed both my primary care physician, my OBGYN, and my therapist. Like when we sat down, I was like, I need to talk to you. And I've been at my OBGYN practice for so long that 2 of my doctors have retired. So, so I'm on the 3rd doctor inside the practice, Dr. Choi. And I said to her in my appointment last year, I said, listen, do you have any plans of retiring to retire like 5 years, 10 years?
Can't take any more losing the doctors.
And she said, no, it'll be a little while. I said, can you just give me a heads up? I just need a heads up. And I said the same thing to my therapist. Listen, I know you're getting older. I need you to give me a year so you can also help me find your replacement. And they were like, it's not a problem, Omi. I will give you more than enough notice and I will be happy to help you identify a new therapist. I said, okay, I just, I'm at this age. My next big birthday will be 60. I need you to let me know how long you're gonna be rocking with me.
Right. And it's great that we feel at this stage of life that we're just going to ask the questions we need to know. Because
Absolutely.
20 years ago, we may not have asked those questions. We wouldn't have.
We may not. And, again, there's so many reasons why people feel kind of skittish, it's like the way that we look at doctors as being the experts. So that way we think of them, we deify doctors in some way. So if a doctor says, this is what you have to do, or you can't do this, or I don't have time to answer a question. And then there are also amazing doctors out there and healthcare providers, nurse practitioners, physician assistants who are so thoughtful, who do make the time.
Right.
Who are very curious about what's happening with you. I feel infinitely blessed that the doctors I have are infinitely curious about who I am and what's happening with me. And every time I sit down with them, they're always like, so tell me what's going on. How are you doing? How are the boys? How's work? Yeah. All right. What are you doing that you're really excited about? How are you sleeping? How's your sleep?
Right.
And so it's clear they know me because they know I'm a notoriously insomnia. I'm always battling that. And so if I have to make that shift with a new doctor, I need them to understand who I am and how I'm made and what's important to me and how I want to be healthy and good to this body that I have for as long as I possibly can,
Leading from that statement, I think is a great place to talk about your deck that you started with Kendra, because a lot of women don't know the questions to ask.
Oh, we don't.
Or how to start the conversation with them. They're actually embarrassed to talk about it, or the stigma around menopause is I'm not in menopause yet. So you guys have actually created a Say More deck. Yes. Can you talk about those?
Yes. So Kendra was one of the first businesses to reach out to me when we launched a podcast for sponsorship. And I'm going to be honest, and I came clean with them last year. I was like, when they reached out to me and said, hey, we would like to purchase some pre-roll and mid-roll, I was like, oh, okay, well, let me get back to you with a quote. I had no idea what they were talking about. None. I was like, what is this? So
what's a pre-roll? What?
Pre-roll? What's the mid-roll? It's like podcast language. And so I contacted my producer and she said, oh, sometimes podcast sponsorship, they will pay you a certain amount of money for that pre-roll where you use that information about them at the beginning of the podcast and then mid-rolls like that break. I said, right. Oh, they're on NPR all the time. Okay, I got it. So I, go back and I come up with whatever number. They're like, sure, no problem. Last year, the team reached out to me and said, we would love to create some merch together. We would love to collaborate with you on some merch. I said, I'm not interested in merch because I'm not interested in being an influencer, like in the way that I don't know what it is. I'm not interested. I said, but I am interested in collaborating with you and offering a tool or a resource that doesn't currently exist. And they were like, ooh, let's do that. So I shared with them when we first launched Black Girls Guide in 2019, we hosted 4 in-person intergenerational conversations, 2 in North Carolina, 1 in Washington, D.C., and 1 in Kenya. And we created a baker's dozen of a discussion cards that will be used in small group table rounds to help people start the conversation. And they had themes, so spirituality, body, love, intimacy, pleasure, death, voice. So all these different themes and the question, and then everybody who was at the table, no matter their age, no matter whether they were menopausal or not, got to answer the question. So I was thinking, how could we translate that into a larger, fuller complement of a deck that a person could use as journaling prompts individually, or they could use for conversations with their friends, with their partner, with their spouse, with their wife, with their husband, with their kids, with their colleagues, with their doctor. And so we came up with 100 cards, and soup to nuts, we did all of this together. So we created all the questions. We worked with an artist around the artwork and what we wanted. We broke it into elements. So they're broken down into fire, water, air, and earth. And
Okay.
each element has 5 subcategories, like unlearn, like reinvigorate, like play, like passion. Yeah, so it's just, identity, grief. And what we wanted to be able to give people were broad prompts as well as very specific menopause and midlife prompts. And so I hosted my first in-person event at the beginning of June to introduce the Say More deck to my local community. And one of the young people who came everybody got a deck as a gift to take home. She took the deck to her grandmother's house the next day. And they're having they decided to use the fire deck, and inside the fire deck is a lot of great questions about sex and play and pleasure. And that's when she learned that her parents, or her grandparents, in fact, are having amazing sex. And so she texted me and she said, Omi, my grandparents are having phenomenal sex. I said, wait, how do you know this? She said, the Say More deck. I said, wait, what? Back up. She said, I took the deck to my grandmother's house. We're going through the deck. Is my mom, my grandmother, my auntie. Then my grandfather chimes in. Then my husband chimes in. Then my uncle chimes in. Then everybody's using the deck to have a conversation. I said, that's exactly what we want. Because, there's a way that people say, well, I'm going to give this to my grandmother. This deck is not for me. Or I'm going to give this deck to my daughter. This deck is not for me. Or I wish you would create a deck for the men, because they need this deck doesn't have a gender. This deck is for everybody. And literally the questions that are asked, anybody can grapple with.
That's amazing.
So, folk who are interested, who may be into oracle cards or discussion cards, a lot of crimes against humanity. There are all these kinds of cards out there. It's that type of deck where it's just really juicy. There's a notepad in there that you can use to take notes. We will often on a card offer you an invitation or a reminder with a particular question. And we, it gives people what they need. And so there's a pamphlet, instruction pamphlet in there to kind of help you learn how to use the deck. But addition to that, Mariah, again, my producer, we created an open source toolkit. And what we mean by open source is we created a toolkit that helps people have a deeper journaling praxis with the deck. So we have different tracks to help people, like if you're new to journaling, here's a way to get started. If you are used to journaling, but you want to deepen your praxis, here's a way to do that. If you are a deep journaler, here's some suggestions we have. And then we do some pairings. We've got some books that we think are a good complement to the deck. We've got podcast episodes that we think are also a good complement to the deck. We created a playlist, but there's a link inside of the toolkit where you can offer your thoughts to the toolkit as well. And that's why it's open source. So you can say, this is what I really love about the deck. This is what I wish the deck could do. If you're going to do another version or edition of the deck, consider adding these parts to it. Here are some books that I think would be fantastic that are really in alignment with the water cards, or really in alignment with the air cards. Here's some songs that I love to add to the playlist. And so it becomes a community toolkit and a way to engage with it. Mm-hmm.
Well, it sounds great. So I can't wait to check it out. And where can people find the deck?
Yes. So you can go to ourkendra.com and do a search for Say More Deck, or you can go to www.Black Girls Guide to Surviving Menopause, and it'll pop up immediately. There'll be a Say More pop up, and you click on that and you can learn more about my collaborative relationship with Kendra. I did a little blog piece on their blog about our partnership. And then there's a button that says buy. And when you click that, it'll take you directly to the Kendra website.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for coming on the show. I think I could probably talk to you for another 2 hours about all
Thank
things.
you. Thank you. Mm-hmm.
I love learning your story. I love what you're doing, your platform. It's wonderful when our community lifts each other up.
It is. It's important.
It really is. And for the most part, that's what we have found, is that, we're just all about getting the word out, that there are resources, that there are people talking, that you're not alone.
That's right.
And everybody's journey is different, but we can all learn from each other's experiences. So
yeah, thank you so much. Thank you for your platform as well, and you all reaching out to me. It feels like the menopause landscape is really, really growing, and in deep, deep, potent ways. And I'm excited to connect with people who are doing the same thing that you said, like creating a larger, broader, more diverse, more intentional community of practice for folk to engage in.
absolutely. So thank you so much.